Welcome to the Three Martini Lunch. Grab a stool next to Greg Columbus of Radio America and Jim Garrity of National Review. Three Martinis coming up.
Hey, really glad you're with us for the Friday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. We've got good, bad, crazy martinis for you today. Jim Garrity is back. Thanks to Scott Bertram for filling in on Thursday. Jim, obviously the big news while you're out was the plane crash, the plane crashing into the Black Hawk helicopter. We'll have more to say about that in our second martini today. And later on, we'll talk about what you wrote about in the Morning Jolt. And National Review has been doing a lot of coverage on, and that's the confirmation process for Tulsi Gabbard, Trump's choice to be the director of national intelligence. And so let's go with our good martini, though, today, because there's actually a debate, not one for office that you would actually vote for as the public, but to lead the Democratic National Committee. When a candidate wins a presidential election, that person decides who will lead the Republican National Committee. Trump has already decided that the guy who was leading the RNC at the time of the election is going to stay there. But the Democrats get to have this kind of free-for-all process and have people figure out who their party leader is going to be. So they had this big forum, lots of candidates at Georgetown University earlier this week. And let's just say it was a little chaotic, because the major headline that came out of this encounter at Georgetown University was pretty much this. So there are a lot of disruptions, is the point at this DNC meeting. You may have heard the person screaming, "Stop taking oil money!" Other people were getting up there saying, "You're taking money from billionaires. Stop doing that." And then perhaps the chef's kiss of the night is when one of the moderators asked everyone on stage, "How many of you believe that racism and misogyny played a role in Vice President Harris's defeat?" Every hand goes up. And the moderator says, "You all passed." So apparently, Jim, the Democrats, they're still getting a lot of grief from the more radical fringe of the party. And it's obvious they learned nothing from what voters were tired of in November of last year.
Greg, first of all, watching that video, my gut instinct is tase him, bro. For those who remember the "don't tase me, bro" response to the protester a couple of years back. And yeah, the view of those protesters is that the Democratic Party is too nice to oil companies, and that's why they lost. No. So I guess we could, make clear the reason I was out yesterday is I went up to New York City for a taping, what I thought was going to be a taping appearance on Abby Phillips' program on CNN. As listeners could probably figure out, when a major air traffic disaster occurs roughly 1 hour before you're going to go on air, your segment ends up going bump. But one of the things we were supposed to talk about is who is the leader of the Democratic Party today. And I think that was kind of like in the context of this Democratic National Committee chair, could be a woman, race. I think for the foreseeable future, whether Democrats like it or not, the leaders of their party in these fights against Trump are going to be Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries. That's not ideal. They probably are not the most telegenic or charismatic, but that's the people who are currently leading the parties in Congress, and most of the fights over the next 2 years are going to be occurring in Congress. Now, will the DNC chairman have a role in that? Sure, but I was trying to think about it. Greg, who would you say was like the last party chairman who you felt like really represented like a major leader in the party? Maybe Howard Dean? I don't think we'd say Terry McAuliffe. He was the, money bags, but like...
Yeah, from a guy who came from a high profile before having the job, it would probably be Howard Dean. And honestly, he was a much better DNC chairman, more effective.
The candidate.
Yeah, unfortunately.
That's something we can shout about. But we can... Kane was in the job, but I don't remember. I think Warner was it. Like, in other words, for all these people who are really up in arms about who the DNC chairman ought to be, I don't think you're going to see a person step in there and suddenly energize the party and do fantastic. And let's remember, everybody had high hopes for Jamie Harrison, the former Senate candidate from South Carolina. People point out he is the first chairman of the Democratic National Committee to begin with the presidency, Senate, and House in Democratic hands at the beginning of his term, and to end with all of them in Republican hands at the end of his term. My understanding is that Harrison recently did an interview that, in the end, the problem was the party gave up on Joe Biden too soon. Yeah, that's the problem.
That was the problem, yes.
Yeah. So there's two problems here. The first, so what does your party committee do? The job of your party committee is really to elect candidates. The job of your party committee isn't really to have that many policy plans. You want the chairman of your party to be largely aligned with the views of your majority. But in the end, it's like, are you a good fundraiser? Can you recruit candidates? Are you good at the blocking and tackling? I remember, a bunch of conservatives having real questions about the Republican National Committee and how well it was doing it heading into this cycle. I think they can kind of point to the scoreboard of 2024, although we might say, a couple of those House races would have been nice to flip a few more of those, give Mike Johnson a wider margin there. I think if the other problem for the Democrats right now is the people who vote on the Democratic National Committee leaders are members of the Democratic National Committee. There's like 160 of them or so, right? It's not a ton of people. And the kinds of people who become state party chairs or state party, national committee members are the kind of hard lefty activists who don't like going over numbers and don't like going over polling and don't like adjusting. They're the kind of hard lefties who really want to hear, yes, we lost because of misogyny and racism. And so it's bad. Like, on the one hand, it's ridiculous to see all these DNC candidates running around saying, yes, that's the reason we lost. On the other hand, that's what they have to say to get elected, because they're trying to appeal to a very unrepresentative demographic, even amongst the ranks of Democrats.
Now, all well said, and just a couple things came to mind based on what you were talking about. First of all, yes, Tim Kaine was a DNC chairman. Of course, you've forgotten. That's kind of how it goes with Tim Kaine. It was right before he ran for Senate.
That
early
man should
Obama
be a
years.
Spy. No one remembers him.
The other thing is that Jamie Harris is the first to start with all those things and then lose them all since Ronna Romney McDaniel in 2017.
Good point.
But so ultimately, it's going to come down to how well the president's doing, how well Congress is doing. But you're right that the main jobs are fundraising, candidate recruitment, and messaging. And ultimately, it doesn't need to be a high-profile person necessarily that does that. Although if they are high-profile, their messaging, if it's good, will get more attention. But the bottom line is, they're still completely focused on the issues that buried them in 2024. And instead of actually learning and thinking about what might actually appeal to people, they're doubling down on failure, which is great. Good job, Democrats. All right, Jim, on to our bad martini now. And this is kind of a multi-layered bad martini, but it relates to the aftermath of the American Airlines affiliated regional jet that crashed into the Black Hawk helicopter, or you might say the Black Hawk helicopter crashed into the plane. Either way, once you've seen the more clear video, it's obvious, unfortunately, why we have no survivors. As I was saying yesterday, when you hear a plane landed in the river after Sully and the Hudson River, you're thinking, oh, maybe there's a chance. But once you've seen the video and how the plane really broke apart in midair, I don't think that many people were still alive by the time it hit the river. But yesterday, of course, the finger pointing truly began in all directions. Trump came out, I think it was late yesterday morning, with some of his cabinet members. Vice President Vance was there. And basically what you want to say in that time is, our hearts are with the families of the victims here. We are going to figure out what happened here, and we're going to make sure that things are safer than ever. That's basically what you want to say. And Trump did say that. However, he didn't just say that. So he also decided to point the finger of blame at Biden-era DEI policies, which it's possible they were a factor here. We don't know yet, unless he knows something he's not telling us. But here's a little clip of what he was saying about the rigorous skills required to be an air traffic controller and what the Biden administration was advertising.
I mean, actually, their lives are shortened because of the stress that they have. Brilliant people have to be in those positions, and their lives are actually shortened, very substantially shortened, because of the stress, where you have many, many planes coming into one target, and you need a very special talent and a very special genius to be able to do it. Targeted disabilities are those disabilities that the federal government, as a matter of policy, has identified for special emphasis in recruitment and hiring. The FAA's website states they include hearing, vision, missing extremities, partial paralysis, complete paralysis, epilepsy, severe intellectual disability, psychiatric disability, and dwarfism all qualify for the position of a controller of airplanes pouring into our country, pouring into a little spot, a little dot on the map.
So, Jim, he's right that the Biden administration was pushing in that direction. We don't know, though, that any of that was affiliated with this particular situation at Reagan Airport. We do know that one person was calling the traffic when two people should have been there, Emily Jashinsky and others reporting that. So we're not sure what happened there. And so if you do know something, say so. If you don't, let the investigation play out, because now it looks prejudiced. Ultimately, you want the best people for the job, and regardless of their background or anything else, you want the best people for the job. That's merit. And so I think that's potentially the point he was trying to make. But the way he said it, it was like, well, people with these conditions are completely unqualified for the job, and so you can't do that. And so I think it's a message that got more muddled than it needed to be, especially on day one of the investigation.
Yeah, and the statement issued by the White House in the hours after the crash was perfectly appropriate. What Trump posted on Truth Social just a little bit after midnight, the night of the crash, was what we've come familiar from Donald Trump. It's Donnie on the car phone calling into news radio, offering his unvarnished gut reaction to something. And it's one thing when you're a candidate, and I know we've all kind of gotten to it, but you're president of the United States. And ironically, this is happening right around the anniversary of the Challenger disaster. A lot of people looking back to Reagan's just exceptional, very brief speech, the primetime address to the country. It was supposed to be the State of the Union that night. It was written by Peggy Noonan, and maybe one of the best speeches you'll ever see any president say, particularly at times of like, you and I are right around that age where we can say a lot of school kids were watching live, and there was for the first time, kids, there's going to be a teacher going up into space, and then we watch the explosion. Everybody instantaneously knows that this has been instant death for these astronauts, and it was just exactly the right tone. And Trump couldn't do that. Trump had to go out and look. I think he's got a very strong argument against a bunch of these DEI programs, and apparently there have been lawsuits about air traffic control hiring. Way too often, DEI initiatives would sound really nice. Who could be opposed to diversity? It turns into don't hire or promote straight white males. Well, it turns out, when you do that, you do not necessarily end up with the best possible candidates. You end up with the best possible candidates who check the right boxes in terms of race and gender and diversity and all this other stuff. The standard rallying cry for these sorts of things we saw in that firefighter video that got a lot of attention around the Los Angeles wildfires is, I want someone who looks like me. And a lot of people point out, I don't care if my firefighter looks like me. I just want them to be really good at the job. I never see air traffic controllers, so I don't really care what they look like, Greg. I just want them to be really good at the job. I don't care. Dwarf, all that stuff, like, maybe you're a dwarf and you're, if you're a short person, whatever the preferred term is now. If you're really good at being an air traffic controller, I don't care. That's fine. I just want good, competent people. There have been various reports that there were 2 people handling a job that is usually 4 people. We don't know why they were shorthanded that night. That's not a particularly reassuring thing. But the other thing is, and my reaction when I heard about this, if you live in the Washington, D.C. area, you go down to Alexandria or any place along the Potomac, you see helicopters going back and forth all the time. Often military, sometimes civilian, U.S. Park Police, Marine One. You sometimes see there's just a lot of traffic along there, and you could argue the flying into and out of Reagan National, one of the best views you ever find, because you have just this beautiful view looking out over Washington, D.C., the National Mall, all that stuff, looking right down at the Pentagon, which was kind of creepy after 9/11. The end result, it's very crowded airspace. And right now, the explanations that we have heard, the official investigations need to be completed, but it sounds like this was a matter of perhaps unclear communication, but no erroneous communication, and pilot error. That apparently they're like a half mile off from where they should be and much higher than they ought to be, and that's what led to the collision. God awful, but it's not clear that there's certainly no malevolence, certainly no... I don't want the President of the United States jumping to conclusions about this. And even if he is generally right on the issue of altering your hiring standards, altering your promotion standards, altering your evaluation standards to prioritize diversity instead of prioritizing competence, this isn't the time and place. And he really went off track yesterday in making I'm not going to say a tirade over this, but a long soliloquy about this stuff, what it didn't need to. Wasn't what the country needed to hear, and it just, I wonder if it weakens the argument if you seem like you're knee-jerk blaming it for everything, every bad thing that happens. So an unforced error on the part of the president, probably not the last one we're going to see, but, hopefully we get a lot more clear answers about the cause of this crash and they'll figure out a way to avoid it in the future.
Yeah, it's interesting. It just dawned on me, Jim, that, like you said, this is the first domestic commercial airline crash since 2009. It wasn't in full bloom in 2009 yet? Social media. And so this is kind of the first one where we're in this reflexive, just like we do after every shooting. Oh, who are we going to blame for this?
Yep.
And as every detail trickles out, does this fit my narrative? Does this fit my narrative? Does this fit my narrative? And so it's jarring because we haven't really had this mass instant reaction to one of these on our own soil. But in this case, I think that's why the instinct is still to find the blame for this. And so, you got folks pointing out that the FAA and transportation was a disaster under Buttigieg. The president said it in very stark language yesterday. And I think you and I have been very critical of Pete Buttigieg. There's an FAA report from 2023 where 77% of facilities were understaffed. And, there's definitely progress to make in a lot of these different areas. But the instinct for a knee-jerk, conclusive, why this happened,
scapegoat.
Whose fault is it? It's everywhere now. And so This is just the first time it's happened in one of these on U.S. soil.
I was struck by the claim. It was from Democratic Congresswoman, I don't remember which one, who basically said that this, Trump fired the head of the TSA. People in blue who are saying, please put your, liquids into a bag. And I'm sitting there thinking, so what do you think the TSA administrator does to tell pilots which direction to go in?
Right.
There's no connection, but they're so eager to say, aha, something bad happened. Here's the connection to Trump. Therefore, it's his fault. It does not. The sheer number of near misses, because it wasn't just at National Airport. We've heard about this at other airports too, and other, my understanding, very minor, planes either coming close to clipping each other, generally on the ground, but just look, you're going to have human error. My colleague Charlie Cook pointed out, by the way, if this accident made you nervous about flying. As you mentioned, 2009, I think it was outside Buffalo was the last major one. He ran the numbers, and basically billions of people have taken, flights in the continental United States since then with no accidents. Flying is very safe. We're going to figure out what happened with this one. I think, as alluded to earlier, this is probably going to be a reflection of human errors in an airspace that maybe doesn't need to be that crowded. My understanding is they have suspended helicopter flights in this area indefinitely. And I think that probably is going to require some serious reviews of, did you just have too many things flying in too tight an airspace for, and was something like this, destined to happen once those human errors became serious enough?
No, I think you're right. And there were some of those allegations. Oh, Trump fired these guys. So, of course, Trump's going to punch back. And now we're in this mud wrestling, 48 hours, not even after the fact. So hopefully the investigation proceeds. We get some clear answers and things will be cleaned up going forward.
Bank of America is full of lies. The Watchdog on Wall Street podcast with Chris Markowski. Every day, Chris helps unpack the connection between politics and the economy and how it affects your wallet. After Trump called out Bank of America for debanking people for their conservative politics, they issued a statement full of lies. Remember who gave the FBI a list of customers that made transactions around January 6th? Whether it's happening in D.C. or down on Wall Street, it's affecting you financially. Be informed. Check out the Watchdog on Wall Street podcast with Chris Markowski on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
All right, Jim, on to our crazy martini now. And while it's going slower than Republicans would like, we are getting confirmations of the president's cabinet up on Capitol Hill. Some of the latest ones are Lee Zeldin at EPA, Doug Burgum at Interior. Those were not particularly controversial. The two that are controversial had their hearings this week, RFK for HHS and Tulsi Gabbard for Director of National Intelligence. National Review has come out in opposition to the Gabbard nomination, and you've written about it today in your Morning Jolt. And the biggest thing for you is on several key issues, how her positions as recently as the middle of last year, maybe even later than the middle of last year, seem to be 180 degrees different than what she was telling the committee yesterday. So what did you notice most of all yesterday that gives you pause?
Well, it's kind of standard. And we saw this a bit in Patel's hearing. We saw this in Kennedy's hearing, some version of, sir, in this date, did you say this? Now, we all know the nominee has said a particular comment, and it sounds it's controversial or incendiary or very inconvenient for the job that they're looking for. And inevitably, the candidate, the nominee will offer some version of, Senator, I'm not familiar with, I don't have it in front of me, and I don't know if that's in context. So they do everything short of, Senator, I'm just a caveman. Your ways confuse me, and I have, because of the massive head injury, I have no memory of anything I said before 10 minutes ago, so I can't be held responsible for it. It was not surprising that Tulsi Gabbard, if she wanted to be the Director of National Intelligence, was going to have to adjust some of her positions and some of her past statements about a whole bunch of topics. But as I went through today, because I remember noticing, listening to bits and pieces of the hearings yesterday, this didn't sound like the Tulsi Gabbard of before. And in a lot of cases, you can get either directly opposite opinions of previous opinions or very different emphases of what part. The one that jumped out at me and kind of spurred the entire newsletter was her declaring the strike on Hossein Soleimani, the Iranian general, that it was right. It was no escalation beyond it, and Trump's policies towards Iran turned out to be very effective to our own national security. Great, that's actually what I thought, I think what you thought, what a bunch of our listeners thought, but that's not what Tulsi Gabbard thought at the time, where she said, quote, "This was very clearly an act of war by this president without any kind of authorization or declaration of war from Congress, clearly violating the Constitution." And then they had the briefing up on Capitol Hill, and her answer was, they provided vague comments, no justification whatsoever for this illegal and unconstitutional act of war that President Trump took. That was kind of the same level flip-flop on Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which she had said was unconstitutional, was an abuse of Americans' rights. She introduced legislation to repeal it, and now she says that it was, crucial for gathering foreign intelligence on non-U.S. personnel. It is a unique capability that cannot be replicated and must be safeguarded to protect our nation. Who should it be safeguarded from? The people who want to repeal it? Meaning you? Oh, by the way, when she was talking to Joe Rogan in summer, she said that the recent reforms had made it much, much worse. So overnight, all of a sudden, she's perfectly fine with that. You go down to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Back when the Russians began, she said, this war and suffering could easily have been avoided if Biden administration and NATO had simply acknowledged Russia's legitimate security concerns regarding Ukraine becoming a member of NATO. And then she said, various other comments that basically said this is Biden's fault, that the U.S. had wanted to start the war. This is all about regime change in Russia. And yesterday she said, no, Putin started the war in Ukraine. Snowden, she said that he's, pushed for a pardon for him. Said that he took actions in the public interest, wanted the government to drop all charges. And yesterday she's like, no, he's violated the law and I will take steps to ensure we never have another Snowden-like leak. So apparently it's something that should never happen again. But, and it's very, but she also, no one should be charged over it. People forget she did not vote to impeach Trump the first time. She voted present, but she also wanted a formal censure of Trump and talked about his abuse of power and his innumerable improprieties and abuses. Now, it's weird enough that she's jumped on the Trump bandwagon. Yesterday in her confirmation, she said, I don't believe for a second that President Trump would ask me to do something that would break the law. Not that long ago, you were talking about his abuses and his improprieties. Anyway. So look, we kind of know. Oh, and then, of course, she said she questioned Bashir Assad about his use of chemical weapons. 4 months after that appearance, she was after that meeting in Damascus, she was on CNN and said that she was skeptical of U.S. intelligence that it used chemical weapons. Spoiler alert, Bashir Assad and his regime used chemical weapons a whole lot. So, again, I think one of the things, lots of politicians flip-flop and a bunch of people responded this morning. Jim, you know how the game is played. She has to change her opinions to get through confirmation. Or, okay, but you notice it's not just 180 degrees. She's emphatic, right? There was no justification for the Soleimani strike. And now it was a really good thing that was really effective. And she doesn't seem to recognize, I learned new information. I was totally wrong on that before. And so I think you can fairly ask, what does she really believe? What does she really think about these things? And if she is, the fact that she is 110% in one direction, and then all of a sudden can turn on a dime, go 110% in the other direction, I don't know if that's who I want overseeing the presidential daily brief and sitting in on the president's briefing every morning. That does not strike me as a reassuring. I was always a skeptic of Tulsi Gabbard. If she sounded like the positions she had yesterday, I'd be much more supportive of her. But I think in the end, she doesn't believe any of this stuff. And I think she says whatever she has to do to get through confirmation. And I think Republican senators are rightfully skeptical of this.
Yeah, it's interesting, those different issues. We've talked about all of them so many times. The Soleimani strike, I think you and I both thought was perfectly fine. I do want warrants.
One of Trump's best achievements, best accomplishments. Yes. Attaboy, Mr. President.
Yeah, I do want warrants for, if you trace a foreign person to an American person, you do need a warrant to search anybody's stuff. I like that. I think Biden's weakness in Afghanistan encouraged Putin, but Putin's obviously responsible for the invasion. And then two things can be true at the same time with Edward Snowden. Yes, he's a traitor. And yes, we learned a lot about the the way intrusiveness of our intelligence system. And so she called out a few things yesterday that, obviously point to the need for major changes in the intelligence community. The 51 intelligence officials with the Hunter Biden letter. We've talked about that so many times. Surveilling Catholics, the whole Operation Crossfire Hurricane, James Clapper lying straight up to Ron Wyden about mass collection of U.S. data, John Brennan spying on Congress, all this stuff. All of that's true. So major changes need to happen. The question is whether she's the right one. And it's the Snowden issue, according to The Hill, that has a couple of Republicans now being more iffy about potentially backing the nomination, specifically Lankford and Todd Young. So we'll ultimately see where that goes. But these are the two. These are the two that are going to be most fascinating to watch to see if they can get to 50 votes. Her and Kennedy.
Yeah. Early in the week, I had written something for the Post making the point that, Hegseth got through. And there were lots of questions about Hegseth. And he was fairly young and not the usual experience you see in a Secretary of Defense and all the allegations. And, when a nominee pledges to never drink again, that's always a little bit ominous. But on the issues on how he actually wanted to manage the military and upgrade the defense industrial base, by and large, Pete Hegseth is a conservative, and is going to be in line with most Republican senators, right? That's not necessarily the case with RFK Jr. That's not necessarily the case with Tulsi Gabbard. They've been lifelong Democrats. And I think if you're a Republican senator, it's easier to get to yes if you're like, look, all this other stuff, in the end, this person's going to do the stuff I want them to do. On Gabbard and Kennedy, there isn't that long time record of, I've been in agreement with this person for a long time. They are very recent conversions to the world mindset of this. And in some cases, they aren't. Cassidy's questioning of Kennedy yesterday was kind of like saying, look, I really want to get to yes here, but you've spent your entire life fighting against vaccines, and I've seen people die because they didn't get vaccinated. Like Cassidy, and I don't think, the other thing I'd written earlier in the week was that Cassidy asked some very basic questions. What are your thoughts on Medicaid reform? And Kennedy, look, all of us, when speaking off the cuff, have probably mixed up Medicaid and Medicare. That's fine. Maybe when Kennedy gave a long answer and completely got it wrong, he meant one when he meant the other. But it was not. It was very clear that Kennedy had not spent a lot of time thinking about Medicaid and Medicare. And that's not that's 85% of what HHS spends money on. That's not a small part of the job. And it's, if you want to say, don't worry, he'll have help. Yes, the guy who's in charge of Medicaid and Medicare services is Mehmet Oz, last seen losing a race to a guy who had a stroke, and of course, Oprah's favorite doctor. So I am less than reassured that this, never mind, I'd like to see these programs reformed significantly. I know we're not going to get entitlement reform in Trump administration. But Kennedy at least seems to have only the most cursory familiarity with the program, which is less than the part of it's like, you knew which day the confirmation hearing was, right? You were nominated November 15th. What have you been doing all this time if you still can't be sure which one is Medicaid and which one is Medicare? By the way, Medicare is what we think of Metascare, right? We're scaring old people in Democratic ads and all that stuff. So really, Medicare should be called old people care. Medicaid is for poor people. We should call it poor people care. I know people wouldn't like those names, but it'd be a lot clearer and people would stop mixing them up, I think.
I think so. And, the issue of chronic health and the problem we're having here and that sort of thing, I think there's a position that he could kind of focus on that niche. I think HHS is a wider berth, and I think he would. I've always been curious about that particular pick.
Yeah. Arnold's old job, President's Commission on Physical Fitness. He would love it. He'd be good at it. He could go around showing his weightlifting and all that stuff. And I think it's much closer to his passions than actually, fighting all day with the HHS bureaucracy. So
maybe he will end up as a czar if he doesn't get confirmed. But we'll find out here soon enough. Votes in committee, votes on the floor, all that good stuff. So, Jim, welcome back. Have a good weekend. We'll see you Monday.
See you Monday, Greg.
Jim Garrity, National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks for being with us today. Please subscribe to our podcast. If you don't already, tell your friends about us as well. Thanks also for your 5-star ratings and your kind reviews. Please keep those coming. Get us on your home devices. All you have to say is play 3 Martini Lunch podcast. Follow us both on X. He's at Jim Garrity. I'm at Greg Corombos. Have a great weekend. Join us again on Monday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.